It's called All the Glimmering Stars. And the New York Times bestselling author joins us now. He's Mark Sullivan, everybody. Hi, Mark.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, and it is just a disturbing fact. You know, that Joseph Kony guy, he's the guy who I remember perhaps in the highest profile way being called out on the brutal realities associated with conscription of children. Maybe you could speak to him, the overall universe that you know so well, and then your book, All the Glimmering Stars.
Sure. Joseph Kony, for those of you who don't know, was a rebel in Uganda. He built an army out of disaffected soldiers from the Ugandan Civil War, which lasted about 8 years. He was very messianic, mystical. He convinced people that he could call thunderstorms, among other things. He spoke to 4 or 5 spirits, and he had a lack of having enough soldiers. So he started kidnapping kids from Uganda starting in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And in all, he ends up kidnapping 35,000 kids, which is a stunning number. And
Yes.
he brings them mostly north across the border into southern Sudan, which is in the midst of its own civil war. And Kony basically sells his child army to the Sudanese government to fight the people who are trying to break up southern Sudan at the time. And these kids are being used in that war, and then they're also being used in a guerrilla war in northern Uganda. Kony was absolutely ruthless. He was believed to have killed or ordered the killing or condoned the killing of nearly 10,000 people. He did take nearly 35,000 kids. And I found out about this particular story, which is emblematic of the story of every kid who was taken by Joseph Kony, and for that matter, is taken anywhere and put into combat. Um, I got this story in a very interesting way. My son, who's also a novelist, Connor Sullivan, called me up one day after a friend of ours had died, and Connor was the one of the executors of his estate, our friend. And he said he had heard a story the night before that I needed to hear because it met all my criteria for what I like to write about. It has to be inherently moving, inspiring, healing to some people, and transformative to others. And in the overall, what I look for is a story of humanity. I want to see something universal. It doesn't matter where it takes place. And when this story was brought to me by a guy named Eric Ulrich and Michael Mulroy. Ulrich was at the time, he was the U.S. SEAL Team 6 Squadron Commander for Africa and the Middle East. And Mulroy formerly had been the CIA station chief in Kampala. And he was the one who heard the story first from Anthony Apoka, who was part of the hunt for Joseph Kony during the Obama administration, when they sent in Green Berets and CIA operators to try to find him in northwestern Uganda and into northern Congo. So anyway, they came to my house and they told me the story, and they said, well, first of all, the story was stunning. I had never heard anything like it in
Well, the
40 years
numbers
of
alone
just,
are stunning, right?
I know, right? And but what they said at the end of describing the story is that we believe that if this story is well told, with all its implications, that it'll end the practice of child soldiering for good. So I was blessed that both Anthony and Florence were willing to talk to me. We meant to go to Uganda in the summer of 20, but of course the pandemic shut us out. So we got delayed an entire year before we could go. But we went expecting to spend 3 weeks with. Again, COVID was rearing its head during the Delta flare up. So we only got 15 days before we had to sort of evacuate Uganda. Otherwise, we were going to get trapped in there for 6 weeks. But we were lucky that Anthony especially, and Florence, but Anthony especially had just an incredible memory for what had happened. And part of this is that Anthony ends up being one of the prime witnesses against Kony henchmen and the entire LRA in the International War Crimes trial at The Hague, which took place up 3 years ago. So Anthony was like one of the major witnesses. And when I realized that, I said, well, if it's good enough for The Hague, then this story is already been shown to be solid because they investigated the heck out of it. And anyway, so I went and I listened to this story, and every day it got bigger dimensions and more depth. And I too came away from the experience of talking to what they went to them about what they went through, believing that it could end child soldiering.
And it's interesting. We know so little, I think, just generally about what's happening on the continent of Africa, and we have such a I'm gonna say it's almost a I don't know if it's a willful ignorance, but it's definitely we have a blasé view of sort of that stuff over there. I mean, it really is juxtaposed against the sort of thing we've talked about on the show today. You know, we're so engaged and so involved with the Middle East, with what's happening with Trump, with the various trials. I mean, everybody's become, with COVID even, I mean, everybody became an overnight, a biologist when COVID hit. Then they became an overnight foreign policy expert on the Middle East when this whole thing went down. But when it comes to Africa, we just don't know much. And that was what was so interesting about the Kony story, and why I really am intrigued by the fact that you really engage with this story for your book, because
Yep.
we did become aware of Kony largely because of what you're talking about. I think Obama called it out. Was that the reason?
It was first under George W. Bush. There was the passage of the Child Soldiers Prevention Act that was reauthorized under Obama. So they began by declaring him a war criminal. And then they began to hunt him because people began to realize the level of the atrocities that were going on under this guy, and the inability of the Ugandan government to root him out, and the unwillingness of the Sudanese government, which was giving him safe haven to train his troops and to his troops to be utilized and he to be paid for it. That's the big part about the story that I don't think most people understand is that the camera did come on this guy for a while when child soldiering, they were trying to do something about it. So what's the big deal? Why are we so concerned about this? And the reason is that according to the UN General Secretary's special envoy for children and armed combat, which is an incredible thing that there even is such a thing, because these envoys are very rare. There are only a few of them coming out of that office, and it's only for issues that they think are global. And the reason they care so much, among other things, is about children in combat, is the studies and have shown that if they don't get out of that environment, under 16 with a weapon in their hands and expected to go into combat, if they don't get the correct sort of rehabilitation and get reintroduced into society, they're probably just going to become hardened terrorists, psychopaths.
Sure. I
It's
mean,
not good for their
and that's the way you
psychology.
think. That's the way you think of so much of these African political systems, run by militias, run by strongmen, run by militants, and you're saying, in a way, it's a self-perpetuating cycle.
It can be in these regions until you go in and you start teaching people just what happens to children and who they become. Um, it's a big issue because it's not just to Africa. It's in South America. It's in Asia. Indonesia. There are people, Syria, Gaza. There are kids fighting in Gaza. Who knows what those kids will become 10 years from now if they're not given the right kind of rehabilitation.
Well, I'm
And,
so
and
glad you
by the
made that
way, the
point. I'm
guys
sorry. Go ahead,
that
please.
brought
Yeah.
me this, the guys who brought me the story, are involved in the building of that pier off Gaza, trying to get
Oh,
food
wow.
in there.
Wow.
So they're working both ends. They're trying to end child soldiering, and they're also trying to feed people in Gaza.
Yeah, if you're just joining us, Mark Sullivan is the author of this book, All the Glimmering Stars. It involves uh, children kidnapped and involved in really a militant army of children. And as you say, they're radicalized, they're abused, and they perpetuate this. But these warlords who are behind this, I'm really glad you mentioned these other places. It's not just Africa, it's not just Kony. And these warlords and strongmen that seem to infest every part of the world, they become politically relevant as well, because as we try to engage these various countries and forces, as you say, you have a growing number of these kids who become adults and radicalized in the same way, and
Yeah.
it's a really kind of scary future.
It is, and when you realize that a lot of these kids have, at least in the case of Kony's army, the Lord's Resistance Army, that um, those kids, and this was what one of the things that really intrigued me when they brought me the story was the SEAL team commander telling me that the training that they put the children through would have buckled half of the U.S. SEALs. 14-year-old
Wow.
kids being put
Wow.
through things that would buckle SEALs.
So they're not
And
just kids who are given a gun and a target. It's
no,
uh
quite the opposite. They were put through brutal training where they had to hike through mountains, going up as high as 10,000 feet, carrying heavy packs, learning how to shoot and fight, and then learning how to survive in wilderness in the middle of Africa. So they would become, a cohesive guerrilla force. Part of this was also a deliberate effort to brainwash them. The interesting thing about this particular story, however, is they both get kidnapped, a boy and a girl, Anthony and Florence. They get kidnapped at 14 years old. And but both of them prior to that have been like these exemplary kids. They were like their class presidents, and Anthony was a brilliant distance runner, and Florence dreamed of being a nurse, and she had the grades to do it when they get kidnapped. So but more importantly, in their particular villages and in their families, they were taught several things. But for Anthony, it was how to be a good human being, not a good man, not a good woman, a good human. And so he starts teaching this to the kid when he's 7. And he also teaches him how to navigate by the stars. And this is very important. That's part of the title. The kid really gets good at navigating by the stars. And by the same token, in this village about 50 kilometers away, Florence is being raised by a mother who preaches to her over and over again that there is nothing in the universe stronger than the power of love. And when they're kidnapped, they're able to hold on to these things, being a good human, believing in the strength of the power of love, learning how to navigate by the stars. And they managed to hold on to those things deep inside, especially the love and the being a good human. And when they meet 5 years into this 10-year ordeal, they legitimately fall in love. And the power of love saves them. It allows them to resurrect these lessons to give them hope, and then to give them the intention to escape and have faith in that plan for 5 years before they actually pull it off. And it's a miracle when they do.
they
Um,
planned their escape for 5 years, Mark Sullivan?
they looked for the opportunity to escape. You have to understand that the Lord's Resistance Army had these teams of trackers that if a kid tried to run, they would send these trackers after the kid. They would take, if they caught the kid, and they usually did because they were very good at it, they would bring him back and they would usually execute him in front of the other children to tell them, don't try to escape. So, Anthony, when he makes his run, you understand it because you've seen a couple of these tracking scenes. You've seen these trackers at work, and you've seen one of them that was in the worst. He was like the toughest tracker, and he's based on a real person.
It's interesting that these two that you focus on, Florence and Anthony, actually, and I know this from the cover of the book. Can you put the cover up again, please, Albert? I guess they wrote either the forward, I think, and the afterward
The
of your
afterward,
book.
the
The
afterward,
afterward. Okay,
yeah,
there you go.
yeah.
What extraordinary people existed in this cesspool of
Yeah,
militancy.
yeah, they are amazing. And, you see how they just have this extraordinary resilience that they believe they're going to escape and they escape. And in the meantime, in that 5 years, they become a real family together and they have kids but extraordinary things happen. Like when when Florence has had it, it's this scene. Imagine this. She has a 3 year old or 2.5 year old on her back. She's carrying a weapon. She is 9 months pregnant.
Wow.
She gets in the middle of a firefight in a torrential rainstorm in the Nile River bottom. To escape the Ugandan forces, they've strung a rope across the Nile in flood stage, and they have to pull themselves across this. She builds a raft from empty Coke bottles, plastic bottles, puts the raft between her legs, puts the kid on the raft, pulls herself sideways, and as she's about a quarter of the way across, she goes into labor. And
Oh my God.
I'm not describing what happened beyond that
Oh
because
my
it's
God.
God. When I heard that scene, I said, people are just going to be blown away at the strength of this woman because
So
she gives
tell
birth during a firefight.
Oh my God. I mean, this is extraordinary. So many
Yeah,
people are saying in the chat they can't wait to read the book. Let me just ask you one quick question about the book and then I'll let you go. But this is, I mean,
yeah,
you've really, I mean, it's such a serious topic and you've clearly, there's so much drama that's built into the real story. Now,
yeah.
you've novelized this, or is the true story that has been essentially documented in this way?
This is a true story that I documented.
Okay,
90% of the book, 85, 90, is based on extensive interviews with Anthony and Florence. So they're direct witnesses. And again, they were the people who testified at The Hague. So
sure,
I
sure.
had a really pretty solid idea. But there were things that I couldn't do as pure nonfiction. First of all, let me give you some examples. There was about 5 people in the story that all had the same name, literally. And I could see it was going to be a disaster unless I changed it. So rather than having 5 people with one name, I condensed them into one character.
I see.
And example, there were so many of these tracking teams that I couldn't tell the stories of all these tracking teams. I condensed them into one tracking team that's led by a master tracker who was a real person, right? So, um, but as soon as you start monkeying with that, it becomes fiction. It is the story brought to life as best as I could based on all the information that I knew.
Well, you're a best-selling author. I'm sure it's terrific. It's called All the Glimmering Stars, and it is the true story, a remarkable story of two soldiers, child soldiers, who escaped this horror that was perpetrated for years by Joseph Kony and continues. I suppose this is, I was going to say continues worldwide. I suppose this is a window on all of this, isn't it, Mark? On all of this continuing madness and
It really
militancy.
is because
Yeah.
the way I wrote the book is you go on the shoulders of Anthony and Florence through the experience. You have access to their mind, you have access to their emotions. You become them as you're reading. And I think that's the power of the book is that it is very much an immersive experience. More than that, though, it comes through, and I want to state this up front. People like Anthony and Florence who have gone through something like this could easily have become professional victims, and they are not at all. Quite the contrary. They wake up every day believing that their life is a miracle, and not just when they escaped, but the entire thing has been a miracle. And when you meet them, because they've gone through the worst of humanity and they kind of represent the best of humanity, they glow from inside. It's remarkable.
Isn't that terrific? Isn't that
Yeah.
terrific? 4 holds on 10 copies of this book already at the San Jose Public Library. I'm number 4, says William Lundgren. And I hope you'll buy the book, Manny. We'll have a link to purchase the book underneath this video so people can do that effortlessly. I will tell you, first of all, you've worked with James Patterson too, I guess, and continue to do stuff with James Patterson, they're telling me. So, I mean, two authors who, who collaborate in that regard. And you were in the Peace Corps.
I was
so
in West Africa.
And I mean, you've seen this this world in which you can see miracles, and you can also see things that just make you feel, I'm sure, as though there's no hope. They coexist in that environment.
They do.
The last thing I'm going to say is that I always like it when there's some commonality that I have with somebody who's great. You're a great best-selling author. You have a clearly, incredibly seductive book in the sense that the story is powerful and dramatic and important. All the Glimmering Stars. And I used to study in the very library of the university that you attended, Hamilton College. How about that?
How about that?
In a way, I'm greatness adjacent is what I'm saying, Mark. I went to Colgate and I couldn't get anything done there because our library was such like a cocktail party. So I'd go to Hamilton where I didn't know anybody and I would do all my studying there. And you attended Hamilton. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Please consider this a place that you can visit again. And all the Glimmering Stars, I wish you all the best with it. As I say, we'll have a link. And your website is marksullivanbooks.com. So all the best, my friend. Thanks for telling an important story. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped. And please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.